Arcade conversions are something I always find interesting, whether it's the unofficial takes made back in the day, or those modern ones which aim to do justice to be as close as possible as you can be for a vintage system. We can't discount the official conversions though, especially when it comes to some of those pre-Crash era games. In fact, seeing those games which fell under the shadow of their more successful predecessors is kind of a thing. Which brings us to Atari's Millipede, which originally saw release into arcades in 1982, before first making the jump into the home 2 years later with conversions for both the Atari 2600 and Atari 8-bit computer line. As a follow-up to Centipede, it should be no surprise that Millipede is a follow-up which simply expands upon the core mechanics of the original game. Unsurprisingly, the goal in each level is to clear out the millipedes from your garden, all the while avoiding the attacks from the other bugs bouncing about, whether it's spiders which bounce around the bottom of the screen, or the earwigs which will poison a row of mushrooms should you fail to blast them before they cross the screen. The biggest addition though is the DDT bomb. If left alone, they're nothing more than an item for the bugs to avoid. Should you blast one, they'll go off in a cloud of fumes, wiping out any bug which happens to wander in. It should not be understated just how useful they are, especially when the garden is crawling with critters. Of the new bugs to infest the garden, the inchworm is the only one which is actually helpful. Blasting one as it crawls about results in every other creature being slowed down for a short period of time. Every few waves, you'll be introduced to a swarm of bugs, whether mosquitoes, bees, or dragonflies. Learning to position yourself correctly is important, as being able to take a large number of them down quickly is a great way to earn an extra life from the score. Finally, for the score chasers amongst you, there's also the ability to start the game off at a predetermined starting score. On the 8-bit computer version, for your first play, this can be at any multiple of 10,000 points, up to a max of 60,000. For your subsequent games, it's any multiple of 10,000 points, up to your previous score, minus 10,000. So, if you scored 125,000, you'd be able to start up to 110,000. Things are a little different with the numbers for the 2600 version. Here, it's any multiple of 15,000 points up to 30,000 for your first play. And for any subsequent session, it's any multiple of 15,000. So, if you scored 105,000 points, for instance, your max starting score would be 90,000 points. With both versions of the game, the only option for controls is the trusty joystick. That's not a surprise really, it is the most popular option out there, but considering Atari released a trackball controller back in the day for the computer systems, it would have been nice to see support for it, especially if you've seen the support offered by Missile Command for the 8-bit computers, which I feel plays incredibly well with the trackball when support is enabled. Though, there is a hack out there for the 2600 version which does support it, so if you are lucky enough to own one, you can find that hack and play that version instead. It should be said, the joystick controls do work rather well, but they do lack that precision which the trackball controls of the arcade original offered. Now, unless you've spent countless hours playing the arcade version, whether on a real cab or maybe with a trackball on MAME or various Atari collections, well, you might not even notice. And so the joystick controls may be perfectly fine for you. Where things felt interesting for me between the two versions here is the speed. From the time I spent with both of them, I was certainly surprised to find that the 2600 was the faster of them to play, making the challenge a little tougher over the 8-bit computer version. But Atari were known back in the day for ensuring their 2600 games were speed corrected for PAL regions. And that's something I wish many other developers had done as well back in the day. And maybe that's because as someone whose systems are primarily PAL based, but I would love to have seen more games be corrected like that, the cursor 50 Hz. And so what that means is the Atari computer version was not speed corrected, so it is a little slower on a PAL system like I'm using here. Though it does still offer smooth animation and visuals. Watching how the Millipede smoothly animates as it moves about the screen really adds one of those things that's a lot of polish. It's a great improvement over the Atari 5200 version of Centipede. And that was a massive upgrade to the original Atari 8-bit computer version of Centipede, which looked really primitive in comparison. Despite the many limitations the hardware offers, the Atari 2600 version is really solid. In fact, even with those limitations in mind, I really found it presented itself quite well. I was very impressed with the attempts at some of the details out there, like the score bonus you get for taking out the spiders. It was surprisingly readable and mimics what the arcade game does, and that is definitely a tough trick to pull off considering what the 2600 was capable of. The only issue with the limitations I found was around the mushrooms. In the original arcade game and on the 8-bit computer version port, as you shoot them, you see them disintegrate. Unfortunately, the way they're presented on the 2600 means that you don't get to really see that happen. You just see a static block that you shoot until it disappears. So, at a glance, it's hard to know which ones you should prioritize to take out. So it just makes things a little more hectic when perhaps it didn't need to be when you want to clear out some space from the garden. For any conversion in general, the most important thing I find is to see how well the mechanics translate over. And I am so relieved to see that both the conversions here, the Atari 2600 and the Atari 8-bit computer ones, translate the arcade game mechanics incredibly well. Millipede I find to be a really frantic game, and I can see why it's not as fondly regarded as Centipede in that regard. But the thing is, that pacing, that challenge, is brought over and preserved, even with the slower speed of the 8-bit version on my PAL setup. I found that version, I really got dragged into the zone as I was recording footage, and the fact that I could rack up some, at least to me, some really impressive scores, really showed how well and how good the game feels to play as a result. Now, the 2600 version might be a tougher challenge because of the speed difference, but sometimes you just might have a craving for that thrill of having to fight back amongst tougher odds, and the 2600 version really delivers that for you. At the end of the day, Millipede could be seen as just an upgrade to Centipede, but for me, it's one I find really has a reason to exist. If you happen to be the type of games player who craves that serious challenge, those intense battles, and that kind of thrill, then it's a great upgrade from all the new mechanics on offer that really has some extra staying power, especially for chasing a top score. Millipede may not have the legacy or the conversions of Centipede, but for me it's more than worthy of a place in your rotation on either of these two versions. Regardless of which one you choose, you'll certainly have a great time freeing your garden from the onslaught of creepy crawlies. And so, what else is there for me to say than thank you oh so very much for taking the time out to watch this video. I'll catch you on the next one.